Hello, I'm Bruce Shackney, Vice President of Market Development at Standard & Poor's. Welcome to Credit Matters TV. The U.S. Treasury expects that its currently authorized debt limits will be reached on or around August 2nd, and it is believed the next significant payments on existing debt are due on August 4th. It is S&P's firm expectation that the U.S. Congress will raise the debt limit, as it has done on 78 separate occasions since 1960. Nevertheless, it is appropriate to contemplate, for the sake of preparedness, the low probability but high impact scenario of a failure to raise the debt ceiling. To discuss this scenario, I'm joined by Paul Coughlin, Executive Managing Director and Global Head of Corporate and Government Ratings at S&P. Welcome, Paul.
Bruce, good to be here.
Let's start by having you tell us about what is S&P's perspective on the likelihood that the debt ceiling will not be raised.
Well, again, as you said, it's our expectation that the debt ceiling will be raised. At the end of the day, the Congress has adopted a budget that already implies a deficit of around 9% of GDP. So the Congress, including the Republican majority in the lower house, has voted for a very large deficit budget. So why wouldn't they accommodate that through a higher debt cap? So our view is we expect to see a lot of posturing. We expect to see a good deal of brinkmanship. But ultimately, we do expect the debt cap to be raised.
Mm-hmm. But what does S&P believe to be the likely outcome if the debt ceiling is not raised? Mm-hmm. Would we automatically consider that to be a default event?
No. At the moment, about a third, actually over a third of all U.S. federal government spending is actually financed through debt. So basically, for every dollar that's being spent, you've got around 65 cents of revenue, and the rest is brought in through issuing more and more debt, which is why the debt limit needs to be raised. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. government will default on its debt. We've seen budget crunches in various U.S. governments, state governments over time, and if you think about how things play out there, this has happened in California, for example, on a good number of occasions, the governments can prioritize their spending. At the end of the day, interest costs are about 5% of all U.S. government outlays. And so it's not impossible to maintain service on debt if the U.S. government decides to do so. Now, the U.S. government hasn't foreshadowed how it would react to a failure to raise the debt limit. And so this is rather speculative, but there's every reason to expect that they would indeed prioritize debt payment and would be able to do so.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us about the relationship between the U.S. sovereign rating mm-hmm. and the U.S. domiciled ratings that, mm-hmm. that S&P assigns?
Sure. Well, obviously the U.S. government and its credit status has a big impact on U.S. domiciled credits, some direct, some indirect. In some sectors it's very direct. For example, if you look at a good number of the larger U.S. say, insurance companies, their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities exceeds their total equity. And so there's a pretty direct connection between U.S. government credit and this credit standing of various insurance companies. There's probably an indirect impact on, say, the U.S. states, that whilst the states have their own independent budgeting and revenue-raising capacity, they receive quite a good part of their revenue from the U.S. federal government, Medicaid, Medicare payments, and the like. And so if the debt cap wasn't raised, the federal government had to cut back its spending by 20, 30, 40%. One would expect that the monies going to the states would be cut back and the states would be impacted. So whilst there isn't a direct sort of lockstep connection with the U.S. rating, we don't necessarily downgrade the states if we downgrade the U.S. Probably there couldn't be too big a distance between those two ratings as a practical matter. Mm-hmm. For the corporate area, impacts are pretty slight. There aren't that many corporates that are rated at or close to the U.S. government, and the impacts of a failure to raise the debt cap or indeed a default would be focused on those companies that mostly are directly exposed to the U.S. government. You can think of defense contractors, those sorts of companies.
Mm-hmm. So where do we see the biggest vulnerabilities, either among credits or in the economy as a whole, if the debt ceiling is not raised?
Well, as I mentioned, there are some direct exposures, but as we think about the debt limit and whether or not it's raised, whilst there has been some focus on the issue of default and some speculation about that, as I say, our view is that a failure to raise the debt ceiling does not necessarily result in a default, providing the federal government prioritises payment of interest, which, given that interests are quite modest in terms of their burden, they're quite capable of doing, and providing, and this is another proviso, that markets remain confident and they're willing to roll over debt. And on August 4, there's a significant rollover of Treasury bills that are due on that date. Providing market confidence remains in place, there's no reason why they can't maintain debt service and why there can't remain orderly conditions in the debt markets. With that said, however, as I mentioned, over a third of the US spending is financed by debt, and the deficit is about 9% of GDP. So effectively, failure to raise the debt limit is saying we're going to move from a very large deficit to a balanced budget overnight. And that would constitute a very profound shock to the US economy. It would be as big a shock as the failure of Lehman Brothers, maybe more. It would be pulling out an enormous amount of demand overnight. And that, if that happened, and there was a prolonged or indeed a permanent failure to agree on a higher debt cap, that would indeed imply as I say, a very profound debt shock and probably another recession in the US. And that, of course, would affect a wide range of companies and governments within the US. It would mean higher unemployment. It would be exactly a very similar experience to the one that we've just gone through.
So apart from the debt ceiling topic, thinking medium and longer term about the U.S. rating outlook, could you tell us about S&P's views on the outlook?
Sure. Well, a number of months back, in a formal sense, we changed the outlook on the AAA rating of the U.S. to a negative. And effectively we're saying that if current trends persist, if the U.S. government keeps on running a deficit at the current rate that it is doing so, and there's no credible plan to reduce that deficit, then as we get 2 or 3 years down the track, the US will increasingly look out of place in that AAA peer group. And we're saying that effectively we probably will take it out of that peer group in 2 or 3 years' time or less if there isn't a credible deficit reduction program agreed. And so, that's the basis of it. The US just has to keep doing what it's doing. It'll look out of place in that peer group. The debt levels will be growing very, very rapidly. At the current rate, it won't be too long before debt gets out to be around 100% of GDP. And again, that's, as I say, is increasingly looking out of place for a AAA credit. Now, that's not the end of the world. Lots of countries would give their right arm for a AA+ rating, and so we're not overstating the importance of that. But certainly, as I say, without a credible deficit reduction plan, the US will just look out of place in that peer group.
Well, Paul Coughlin, thank you very much. We will continue to follow the situation closely and will communicate with the market in a timely manner if the debt ceiling situation changes. Thank you for watching Credit Matters TV. Goodbye.